Hello and welcome to Community Forum. My name is Roy Cohen and I'm your host. I think you'll find today's show one of the more interesting ones that we've been putting together over the years. My guest is Norman Katz. He's a resident of Cape Cod, but after a very long stretch of involvement politically, etc., in the town of Sharon, Massachusetts. I guess that's a brief introduction to my friend Norman. Welcome to the show, and let's let it all hang out.
Okay, good morning, Roy, and guests who are watching the program. I'm Norm Katz. Believe it or not, I'm going to be 86 years old in a few weeks, and I am the last survivor from the continuity of government program at the White House in Washington, D.C., obviously. I was on duty along with my wife that day in 1963, the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. I was military attaché to Jim Rowley of the U.S. Secret Service and McCone, the director of the CIA, John McCone, the director of the CIA. As I'm wearing my CIA shirt now that wore back at the time on occasion. I was a lieutenant in the Army. And prior to that, I served 32 years as selectman and police commissioner in the town of Sharon. When I started, there were about 11,000 people. And after 32 years, when I retired finally, there were close to 18, 19,000, maybe 20. I'm not even sure. And I believe in term limits on my terms. I always wanted to, step down and give someone else a chance. But everyone asked me to stay, including almost all the town employees. The job of selectman was difficult. We had a 3-member board. We were basically non-political, and everyone just seemed to get along. But it was a pleasure, serving the community. And my motto was always, what can we do together to make the town a better town to live in? And I could never speak about my background in the military. It was just, town business, and everything was classified. And from there on, graduated Northeastern. I went through ROTC and became an officer in the Signal Corps. I was married on April 16th, 1961, and a few months later, we went into the service. What is interesting is back in those days, we had no cell phones, literally no computers. However, the orders were different coming through from the military. Those of you who have served, I'm considered a Vietnam War veteran, yet I never served in Vietnam. I was always in the military district of Washington. And my first orders before I was married were for the Republic of Korea. And one day in history class, someone came to the professor there, and I even remember the professor's name, Donald S. Tucker, and said that there were 2 men in the president's office, the president of the university's office, that wanted to speak with me. I was a kid, and I had no idea. I knew my tuition may have been late, and my tuition back in those days at Northeastern was $500 a year. Can you imagine? I think it's close to 85,000 now. And I went down to see them, and obviously, a little nervous. And they said that my orders have been changed. I don't know why I was selected. They said I had to pass a background investigation, couple of polygraph tests, so on and so forth, to get a proper clearance to go where I was going. However, they wouldn't tell me where I was going. They said it would be somewhere in the United States, but I had to pass a background investigation and clearance first. And I told them I was getting married, and they says, talk it over with your wife and see if you're willing, to take this particular position. Obviously, I did. She wasn't my wife at the time, but soon after. And I said, you can go with me, Myrna. That was, my wife's name is Myrna. And she's, other than, Korea, you couldn't go. But they said that if I agreed to take the job, your wife could go with you, accompany you on this wonderful tour. Needless to say, I passed the background investigation. I passed the lie detector tests, and some of the questions were hysterical. And we were off to Winchester, Virginia. That was in the military district of Washington. Had no idea where we were going. We used, what do they call, the triptychs from AAA. There was no Waze or Google Maps or nothing like that. We packed up our Volkswagen and headed out to an amazing, amazing, amazing life and experience. We were assigned, I didn't know, to the White House. However, I wanted you to know that people assume that the White House is at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Well, back then, there were 7 White Houses, and they were not obviously all in D.C. When they say the military district of Washington, this goes out into Virginia and, surrounding areas. My wife was a Department of the Army civilian, but she hadn't passed her clearance yet, so she couldn't accompany me on my first few months in office. The clearances I have were incredible. I had obviously top secret, crypto, United Nations, Q clearance, cosmic, White House, maybe 10 or 11 various clearances. And we worked at what they call Mount Weather. If you can Google it now, that's where FEMA headquarters is now, outside in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. And I would go back and forth downtown, what we called it, to the actual White House to do some of my work. And the basic job of the continuity of government program, I don't know if it still even exists or may exist under another name. If the purpose was, if the president of the United States was out due to a, say, natural disaster, nuclear holocaust, or an untimely death, the government had to continue to run. Now, this was not unusual back in those days. People were unaware that's my Great Dane barking in the background. People were not really aware of what was going on. We worked inside a granite mountain that contained crematorium, reservoir, its own police force, its own fire department, all under the Corps of Engineers. We had TV rooms. We had a huge cafeteria, fully staffed hospital, and a duplicate of the White House, just the way, it stands today, of the interior, the president's quarters, including John F. Kennedy's rocking chair. And it was, to me, when I first went in, it had, let me tell you about blast gates first. To get in there, you needed an inside badge, an outside badge. Very, 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 very classified. And I was a kid who, 22, 23 years old, who ever heard of it and knew that this was going to be something that I was going to live and see. And eventually, my wife passed her clearance, and she joined me. She was Department of Emergency Planning, or Office of Emergency Planning, OEP. It was Department of the White House. And they used to like husband and wife teams due to security reasons. I remember our staff cars that we had back and forth was Bonneville Pontiacs with typewritten on the side, property of the U.S. government, in typewriter-sized letters on the bottom. But you wouldn't know. And each vehicle had a phone in it, and not a cell phone. It was like a phone that you would have in your house, but it was all connected through radio transmissions. We could talk all over the world from that particular car. My job was just unreal, and you had to pinch yourself every now and then to get used to it, where you were going. We'd leave in the morning and drive about 25 miles out to the mountains. You'd leave your vehicle at the top, walk downstairs to what they call the East Portal. And it was all shaded with camouflage on it because the presidential Marine helicopters, Air Force 1, 2, 3, and 4 at the time, were kept there on the mountain. And when we got down to the portal, you could see slits in the front wall with 50 caliber machine guns sticking out of them. And that was the Army Corps of Engineers, their police department. There was no military there except the officers assigned. They had the White House Communications Agency, what my team was called U.S. Army Interagency Communications Agency. It was all kind of clandestine names, really didn't mean anything, but it was all having to do with our government and the White House. We had what we call an Office of the Washington Warning System. Should something happen from that particular facility, we had an office that could set off all the alarms or sirens down in D.C. for federal workers to evacuate. this would be in case of a nuclear holocaust. Obviously, if we knew that it was coming in, how does the government, continue? We had. I'm trying. You think back. I mean, here at 86 years old, you don't forget. You remember more and more each day. I can picture myself going to work, going into the building, so secure that we could take a direct nuclear hit and still survive there for like 9 months to a year. Its own air conditioning system, crematorium, it had everything. And you live in there, air filtration system. And a big thing of the day sometimes was lunch in the cafeteria. They had to prepare. There's several chefs who had to prepare, always ready for the president of the party or the party diplomats, the cabinet, the Supreme Court, the Senate. We could house and sleep 3,000 people, maybe 2 to a room, or the families, the Senate, House of Representatives, every official in the White House, including the president, obviously, vice president, and their family. And can you imagine me after I left there, coming home to Sharon and being a selectman for 32 years, never talking about it. Never, ever talking about it. Where did you serve? I said, well, I was in the Army. I served in the military district of Washington. That's all I asked. I mean, it was so unique. What are we, 2023 now, getting ready for 2024? And it was one hell of an experience. Just for a person to go through it and to see what I saw beginning with the Cuban Missile Crisis and how close this country came to a nuclear holocaust was unbelievable. I remember after the president had decided that he was going to have an ExCom, an executive committee, to decide what to do with the Soviet Union, who were building missiles and installing missiles in the country of Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Miami or the Keys. It's not that far away, right in our hemisphere. And it would take just, 15, 20 minutes to get there on a jet plane. And we took pictures and we saw what was going on. And all Russia did was deny that they had them. Those of you who were watching, who are of age, can remember Adlai Stevenson speaking at the White House, at the UN, when he approached the ambassador from Russia of the United Nations, and they kept on denying it. And he showed them pictures, and they denied and denied. Yet we knew that this was going on. And there was one casualty of the whole Cuban Missile Crisis, and that was Major Rudy Anderson at the time, who was flying one of those U-2 planes, and he was told, don't get shot down, Rudy, because the U.S. is going to have to deny it. And he was shot down. And that was the only casualty. And the president had to decide, and he spoke to the nation that night, And he said, instead of attacking Cuba, that we would make the first strike, that we would blockade Cuba. And I have, photos of the blockade and everything that happened to see who was going to blink first, the United States or Cuba. And we were so close. I remember being in the war room at the time, of the Situation Room, as they call it today, with General Curtis LeMay, Chief of Staff of the Air Force. You may recognize a name. And he said to me, Norman, I would like you to get NORAD on the phone, North American Air Defense. And from that, out in Colorado, I may be going too fast, but as it comes to my memory, I don't use notes. It's all by my memory and what I observed. And from that, in Denver, Colorado, outside of Denver, North American Air Defense, we had dispatched 23 jet fighters who were to go. They were armed with nuclear warheads, and the technology back at that time was to fly out, and they had a patch over one eye. They flew out. I'll explain why. They flew out up over the West Coast, through Alaska, over Alaska, into Siberia. And if they were designated to drop their weapons, they were given a designation. Once they dropped their weapon, they would put a patch on their eye and switch it to the other eye because of the flashback. Obviously, that never happened. I had to get NORAD on the line. So I had to leave that room and go upstairs to the cryptography department in another floor in that building. There were several floors in each of the buildings. And remember, this was inside a mountain in Virginia. And I got upstairs. The first call I made was to my parents, to my mother. And I got her on the phone. She had no idea where I was. And I said to her, Ma, fill up the bathtub with water. She says, Val, are you crazy? Where are you? I says, Ma, I can't stay on the phone. Just fill up the bathtub with water so you'll have drinking water. And I had to hang up the phone and obviously go right to NORAD. I got them on the line and had it transferred down to General LeMay, who obviously had to give the orders. I was a second lieutenant at the time, gave the order to dispatch the jet fighters out of Colorado, Cheyenne Mountain, it was called. And then we had to get waiting and watching the Russian ships, the Marukla, they were of Lebanese registry, heading towards Cuba. And the president came on the air that evening on prime time and told, the United States, the people, that we're going to blockade Cuba instead of attacking them and see what would happen. Just see what would the next move would be for our military and naval forces. Let me tell you, it was tense. It was very, very tense. And I, as a young officer, was very much aware of it. And then we were waiting. We sat there about 15, 20 minutes in silence, watching on cameras with the Russian ships coming. And the president said that he would like to speak directly to Premier Khrushchev of Russia to talk one-on-one. So I was the communications officer, basically, and they says, get a hold of the White House Communications Agency, have them contact the Soviet Union and see if they could get Premier Khrushchev on the line and let them know President Kennedy of the United States wants to speak with him directly. Again, we had the phones transferred, the call transferred down to the Situation Room, and the president spoke directly with Nikita Khrushchev. And the conversation was pretty brief, maybe 5-6 minutes. And Khrushchev stated that there were nuclear missiles, being installed in Cuba. And he says that he didn't want a war, and he knew that Kennedy didn't want a war. He says he would stop the missiles in Cuba if the United States would take their missiles out of Turkey. That was their biggest threat at the time. Little did the Russians know that the missiles in Turkey weren't armed and they were not ready to go yet. And Kennedy says he would do it, have them removed immediately, but Khrushchev has to order that the missiles in Cuba be dismantled again the next day. Not in a week, but the next day. Both things happened. We started taking missiles out of Cuba, but the next day, the Russians were dismantling. It was all confirmed and verified by U-2 planes, dismantling everything out of the country of Cuba. I mean, it was incredible to have the two presidents speak directly to each other. And I was the one who got them on the phone. And this was in 1962. And I remember they had a 50th commemoration at the Kennedy Museum, the JFK Museum and Library in Boston. You can see it right off the expressway. And excuse me. My wife and I sat beside Sergei Khrushchev, Dr. Sergei Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev's son, who was a professor at Brown at the time, and his wife. And I have photos of them with me. And he says his father, even though he was banging his shoe when he spoke at the United Nations at the podium, he wasn't as crazy as you thought. It was all an act. And he liked President Kennedy, and he kind of respected him. So you look at today and what we have going on with Russia now, and how different it was 60, 61, 62 years ago. And it's just amazing. Nikita Khrushchev, the premier's son, emigrated, like I said, to this country. He was a professor at Brown University in Rhode Island, and he passed on a few years ago. He took his life, unfortunately. Many people don't know that. And I think it was a loss to this country and to history. And from there, the White House, we moved on to other things. Vietnam the Bay of Pigs were over. I'd come on after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and it was starting up in Vietnam. It was just starting, and who knew? I wasn't there. I just knew of the horrors and the tragedies that were going, that were starting. We didn't have many what we call advisors there. And that built up, becoming an unpopular war. And what happens. The tragedies, I don't have to talk about. Those of us who are of age, those who served, those who never came back, and those who fought gallantly, lived and died through that. Some gave a little and most gave all. I remember it was towards the end of my active career. And in between, we had President Kennedy's trip to Dallas. And it's a long thing that's still going on. Many of that activity that day is still classified, but more and more come out each year. They declassified some information. It was an election year for many in Congress, and the president wanted to support them. So he was going to fly to Love Field in Dallas, Texas, and was accompanied by Dave Powers of the White House. And he was the only one of the big three. What's his name? Davy Powers was on his three staff. O'Brien, Kenny O'Donnell, Larry O'Brien, and Dave Powers were instrumental in, that was the president's staff back then, of running the White House, along with Bobby Kennedy, who was then, the Attorney General. The president went on US 1. Lyndon Johnson went on US 2. And they went to Love Field first in Dallas. There was a speaking engagement in Fort Worth the night before. And then the second day was a motorcade to Dallas. Back in that time, all the presidential limousines were open cars. The only thing they had a plastic rain shield that would come up. Now, for those who were involved in government, knew back in the early 1960s, we only had 312 members of the Secret Service. It was the old boys club. Everyone more or less knew everyone by first name. Now, 312. Can you imagine? Today, there is approximately 7,000. The number is classified. The duties are more involved today. And who went to Dallas and Fort Worth on the trip were about, I think, 23 agents. And it's obviously history. They stayed overnight. Excuse me. The voice isn't the same as it used to be.
Doing okay for a minute. No notes.
Let me take a minute. They stayed overnight, the gentleman from the Secret Service. The next day, they had to be on duty 7 o'clock in the morning. People don't know that night in the Fort Worth area, there was kind of a speakeasy, and many of the members of the 22 of the presidential team were out drinking until 2 or 3 in the morning. And that was a sad moment, on our part. Not that they could do anything, but you had to be ready to go. At 6 to 7 in the morning, with only sleeping 2 or 3 hours, very, very difficult to do.
Norm, why don't I suggest you can take a sip of water there?
Okay. It all comes back to me, Roy. And you get a little emotional over the whole thing. The president did not want the cover on top of the limousine. Not that it would be able to do anything. It just kept the rain off. A bullet with a trajectory and enough power could penetrate it. It was not bulletproof. He wanted to see the people and touch hands and flesh. The motorcade, first car was Jesse Curry, the police chief of Dallas, and along with Win Lawson, who's since passed, of the Secret Service. He's gone. He's passed many years ago. That was the second car. The third car was the Secret Service limousine, and Dave Powers was in that third car. Davy Powers from the White House staff. And the fourth car was Lyndon Johnson, and the congressman from Texas. The route was in the newspaper the day before. They didn't, check roofs at the time, manhole covers, buildings, Secret Service. We didn't have enough. The police didn't have enough. And they headed towards Dealey Plaza. And when they approached Dealey Plaza, and the crowds were good. I mean, the people around the plaza were all nice. I mean, there was no hatred. You couldn't see signs of violence. The motorcycles were running, along the side of the presidential limousine. The only weapon they had in the Secret Service follow-up car was a rifle, a long-range rifle. It was, on the back of the seats. Weaponry, obviously, was different back then. As they approached the plaza and started to turn, one shot rang out, and the limo, presidential limo, thought it was a backfire from one of the motorcycles. However, Clint Hill, who was on the running board beside the driver of the Secret Service follow-up car, thought something else. That first shot that was fired by Lee Harvey Oswald missed, went through a stop sign that they found maybe 10 or 15 years ago and hit the sidewalk. The second shot, now this all happened between 7 and 9 seconds. The second shot fired, went through the president's back and come out in the lower half of his throat. Give me a chance. And he slumped over, the president, into Jacqueline's lap. as Clint Hill ran to the back of that car. And you remember pictures of Mrs. Kennedy, like looking like she was climbing to get up and out. She wasn't trying to get out. She was reaching for a portion of the president's skull when the third shot hit, that flew off and was on the back of the presidential limousine and then slid off onto the lawn there, right around Dealey Plaza. And that was found, later on. 3 shots were fired by Oswald, who had a weapon from Italy, a Mannlicher Carcano that he bought. He bought from a sporting goods store. It was a Klein's sporting goods store in Texas for $16.95, something like that. And he used like armor-piercing bullets, very, very, very strong bullets. In the presidential limousine, obviously, was President Kennedy and his wife, Jacqueline, John Conley, the governor of Texas, and his wife, Nellie, the driver of the presidential limousine, Billy Greer, and the agent in charge of the motorcade, Roy Kellerman. They're all gone. Everyone is obviously dead and old age, what have you. And it was interesting to know that here was Lee Harvey Oswald, who was Section 8 out of the Marines, unfit for military duty. And he worked at the book depository down there in Dallas, Texas. And he wanted to go to Cuba. He wanted to go to Russia. And I have saved all the documents from my term back then. And he wasn't allowed in. He just hated the government of the United States. And he was born in this country, and he married a very nice woman, Marina. It was a Russian, background, but she was a nice woman. She didn't know what the hell he was up to. But he had a sniper's nest that he set up on the 4th floor or 6th floor, I don't remember, of the Dallas Book Depository. It was a sniper's nest. He piled up boxes, and when he was coming into work that morning, he brought that rifle with him, and they carpooled. And the fellow in his carpool says, "Lee, what do you have in the green bag like?" And he says, "Oh, there were draped, curtain rods." He had to go out afterwards for the house. It was that rifle covered in like trash bags. And he fired the 3 shots. We found, obviously the nest and the shell casings around it, everything that you're supposed to find.
No,
the third shot.
Yeah. Ask you, were you along on this journey?
No.
Also?
I was supposed to go, but we had other things going on in Washington, and they asked that I stay. That I said I did not go to Dallas. My orders were to go to have them written down to go, accompany them to Dallas, but I was not in the Secret Service. I was military attaché to Jim Rowley, who was the chief of the Secret Service, and he went. He didn't go that day either. We didn't obviously never expected this, and it was different at that time. We didn't have an ambulance follow and a medical car and an anti-terrorism, suburban, what have you. The presidential limousine today is like 22 to 30 vehicles, besides the police vehicles that go with it now. I was not there.
All right, let me ask you this, Norm. There's a couple of points. There's a couple of points that you listed on your resume. One was the LBJ administration in the Vietnam War, and the other subject, which I'd like to, hopefully we have time for, it seems to be quite timely, what the government knew and kept secret since 1955 on unidentified flying objects and aliens. So,
okay,
your choice. But again, I'd like to spend time on that.
All right, give me 2 more minutes on this, and then I'd love to get into that because that's current.
Okay.
The president was taken to Parkland Hospital. They attempted to. He still had a heartbeat. He was dead. He was dead though. He couldn't have survived. 3 bullets, 7 to 9 seconds. Lyndon Johnson was also taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Governor Conley was injured in the shooting at the during the motorcade, and we all know what happened there. He was sworn in as President of the United States back at Love Field on the plane by Judge Sarah Hughes. The only mistake we made, in my opinion, and many in the medical field, was he should have been autopsied there at Parkland, but he was autopsied at Bethesda Naval Hospital when he came back to Andrews Air Force Base. And there's the shooting, all kinds of conspiracy theories were blowing smoke at us, really, at our rear end. We didn't know it. But what happened, happened. One of the biggest tragedies of the 20th century. And we go on from there. Lyndon Johnson was sworn in. He didn't want the Vietnam War, and we had to eventually get out of it. But let me address what was going on since then. My son told me recently that I was crazy, and my son is 56 years old. But what I saw, and I'm going to talk about Roswell, New Mexico, and the UFOs. Folks, I was a kid. I was 23 years old. We flew one night in 1963. It was October of 63 to the airfield right near Roswell. On that flight, it was a stealth flight that took off to visit the site, was Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, General Curtis LeMay, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, David M. Shoup, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Maxwell Taylor, Chief of Staff of the Army, Bill Elder, Chief Foreign Officer from the White House Communications Agency, and myself. And I was a first lieutenant at that time. We flew in an airplane, left late at night. All the shades on that plane had to be down. And we landed in the Roswell area. The name of the airport just slips my mind. However, as we were landing, I saw no lights on, no landing path, nothing that was clear. And all of a sudden, like little purple lights, they were purple lights, lit up a runway so that we could come down. And we landed in the middle of the night, were picked up by some vehicles, taken to a building and shown pieces of metal from this thing that had landed. And they were explaining to us it wasn't metal that we were familiar with. It looked like tinfoil, but much, much, much thicker. And the colors, were different. They were explaining everything. And then the shocking fact, I remember, we landed at Groom Lake, Nevada. And that was the landing field near Roswell. And, I'm looking, to me, it looked like a piece of metal. I didn't know, but they were explaining what it was. And then they took us to another building. We were there maybe a half hour in all. Once we landed, the whole trip was about a half hour until we got back, back on the flight to come back to get back to Andrews. They took us to a room that was like a laboratory. And we had to stand back maybe 10 or 15 feet from a Lexan or a plastic shield. And behind that shield, there were two, I don't know whether they were men and women, two people in white suits with masks on, a glass type of mask that they would keep, that they were wearing, that gloves and everything. And it was like shelves. It was like a crematorium. It was crazy. And we just stood back behind this glass shield, maybe 10 feet away, even maybe a little bit closer. And they pulled out one of the drawers, and I was 23. They pulled out one of the drawers, and there was a person on it. I mean, it was a thing. I remember seeing a large head, two eyes. I don't remember a nose, but like a mouth. I don't remember seeing any genitalia, but I remember seeing fingers, long, thin fingers and toes. And this thing had like a protruding stomach. And it was a grayish, purplish color and was less than 5 feet in height. Then they pulled out another drawer. It's like a slab. Pull it out, and there was another individual on that was not alive, some creature. It had a large head. Same way. I don't remember seeing a nose, but I remember a mouth. I mean, I was kind of petrified. What in hell were these? Had a mouth, and it was about 4 feet tall. And the only one who said something was Curtis LeMay. He says, "Oh my good God, what in hell is this?" Had a cigar in his mouth. Everyone else just looked. The room was very quiet. And then they pushed the drawers closed. Now, I'm telling you, like I'm telling you right now, I saw it. They weren't made up, as far as I know. They were big enough. I mean, it didn't look like a dummy. And the people who were showing us for medical purposes or infections, or who the hell knows what it was. But we weren't the first ones who saw these. I saw it. If you told me the story, I'd say I'm getting BS'd. It's not true. I saw it. Could never talk about it. We had to sign a non-disclosure when we left. It's over 60 years. I think that craft went down in 1947. I don't remember when that saucer crashed. Now they call it undefined. What do they call it? Not flying saucers, unidentified flying phenomenon. Because others have seen it. Commercial pilots have seen them. Military pilots have seen them. Russia had one, an alien that was alive when they got it. They never talked about it. But who's to say that we are the only ones in this universe? Who's to say? How were the pyramids built? How did tons and tons, how did they lift and carry all those things? Thousands of years ago. Who's to say that we are the first ones that are on this earth? The government just admitted in 2013, okay, that things exist. And the Senate and Congress are having hearings on it now. I don't know if they'll ever show you aliens. I'm taking it to my grave. I saw it. I have pictures of it. You can look on the internet.
We have 1 minute left to the interview.
Okay. There's pictures on the internet of it. It's not a made-up story. If I tell people nowadays, people who are educated understand that they walk amongst us. We don't know. But folks, those things exist. I saw it. More or less, end of story. And thank you for letting me bring you my background to the best of my ability at my age now, in a couple of weeks, of 86 years old. And I appreciate it, Roy, and thank you for letting me speak again.
No more than I do. I really appreciate you spending the time and telling the story as you did. I guess that'll be the end of it, and we'll see you folks. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.